If you would turn in your La Biblias to capítulo 33, Exodus 33. Last time we looked together at the first 7 verses. Tremendous study. I hope you didn't miss it. It was probably the best study we've had so far in the book of Exodus. I know, I'm saying all that just to mess with Jenny. Jenny said, I've got a birthday party, don't preach a good sermon. You're going to miss it. So it was a good time. Real special time there. But so far, we've seen Moses was going to be gone for 40 days. And at some point before that, are you lacking? Did I not print enough papers? I think there's more over there, guys. Yeah, there's more. There's still more over there. So 40 days, at some point before that, they made a golden calf, and there God told Moses he was going to wipe him out and start afresh and start a new country for Moses. He said, no, God, you can't do that. And it was this wonderful anthropomorphic conversation which revealed Jesus and revealed him interceding for us. And in this sake, Moses didn't have the goods. All he could say was, well, if you're going to blot me out too. If they can't go to heaven, I can't go to heaven, or something along those lines. Or if they're going to die in judgment, then kill me alongside them in judgment. And the Lord said, okay, you got me, Moses. Of course, all this was for us to see God as he relented, but we know God doesn't relent, but yet it appeared that he did in this story. But he said, I'm not going to be able to personally go with you. There's going to be something a little less. And that is going to be, I'm going to send an angel to go with you, an angel, small a. And again, God was testing the people. Is it just getting to the promised land and getting the blessings is what you really want? Or is it me that you want? And the people surprisingly mourned and repented, and they acknowledged that they wanted the Lord. And we ended last time in verse 7, and I want to read that again. Moses took up his tent and pitched it outside the camp, far from the camp, called it the tabernacle of meeting. It's not the tabernacle that we've been describing for chapters and chapters, but he couldn't wait to get the official tabernacle, so he just made his tent a quick tabernacle, called it a tabernacle. It didn't have any of the functions that a tabernacle later would have, other than meeting God there. And it came to pass, everyone who sought the Lord went out to the tabernacle of meeting, which was outside the camp. So Moses comes back and he just grabs his own tent and starts walking and walking and walking until he's a distance away from everybody. And there he gets serious with God, and everybody wasn't instructed. Nobody was told. It's just people that started having a desire for the first time to worship God, to seek God, began to go out. Wasn't convenient. It wasn't easy. It was no doubt had to be planned ahead of time, had to be a very purposeful event to go out and kneel in the sand and the dirt out there in the desert next to Moses' tent while Moses was inside seeking the Lord. It's a beautiful thing that happened. Wait just a minute. Let's think about this. They're in Egypt. All these miracles happen. They come out of Egypt. The waters cover the sea and destroy the Egyptians. And then they're introduced the manna and in the mornings, and then the pillar of cloud by day, the pillar of fire by night. And of course, they have Passover, and they sprinkle the blood on the door and all of that right before they leave Egypt. But what instructions to worship God have been given? They're out in the desert, they're in their tent, but yet They might have been told, God likes you to sing to him. God likes you to pray to him. God likes you to sacrifice to him. He really hasn't told them any of this. They're just out, hanging out, eating manna. And when Moses is gone, really it shouldn't be surprising to us at all that they turned back to the paganism that they did know how to act and interact with, building a golden calf and so forth. But something happened after this. When God said, I'm going to bless you, and you're going to have the land flowing with the milk and honey, and all the descendants are going to inherit the land, but I just am not going to be there with you in my presence. They realized the promised land is just another location on earth. It's just dirt, trees, grass, hills, valleys, river. It's really not a sacred place more than any other place on earth unless God is there with us and God puts his name there. So going into the promised land, it's going to be like any other land if God's presence isn't there. God's presence is what makes the promised land a different land. It's God's presence that makes us a different people, unique from all other peoples. But here we see the beginning of the power of God's Spirit moving in revival, if you would, or a great awakening, if you would. And notice what happened to everybody, not just the handful of people that did the marching out to Moses' tent, but notice what happened. In verse 8 through 10, so it was, whenever Moses went out to the tabernacle, that all the people rose, each man stood on his tent door, and watched Moses until he had gone into the tabernacle. And it came to pass when Moses entered the tabernacle that the pillar of cloud descended and stood at the door of the tabernacle. And the Lord talked with Moses. And all the people saw the pillar of cloud standing at the tabernacle door, and all the people rose and worshiped, each man in his tent door. So at this point, Moses ended up having, I guess, two tents. One that he actually lived in, probably near the tribe of Levi at this point. And then he had his tent that he used to sleep in, but now it's just a prayer tent. And so when Moses, at whatever time he got up and got around and talked to the leaders and dealt with whatever civil issues he had, there was a point in the day where Moses said, it's time for me to go seek the Lord. And as he marched that way, the word began to spread. And everybody began to take notice. Maybe there was like a main road down the middle there. The kids came out and watched, and it's almost like a parade. People are joining on the sides as Moses is walking through the midst of them. And everything stops. Everything begins to get a holy hush. And Moses gets to the tent out there. And of course, you can't have 2 or 3 million people all go out next to Moses' tent and pray. It's not physically possible, right? Especially the women that had kids and so forth. And so everybody had this sense of a need for God. That's what happens when revival comes. Man, I can tell you some wild and crazy stories back in the Jesus movement. But the bottom line was people hungered for God. I'd pick up hitchhikers, and I could barely open my mouth, and they were weeping and repenting of their sins, ready to receive the Lord, and I'd see them that week at church. It was just, we'd go out to the beach, and guys would be around a campfire and just start, let me tell you about Jesus. And they're like, tell us. And there'd be 50 Navy guys there in San Diego, and they would all come to Christ. We thought about Jesus. We woke up about Jesus. We talked about his word all day. We just could not get enough of Jesus and his word and fellowship and the knowledge of God's word. And so just, wow, What an amazing picture this is, especially from heaven's point of view. Look at what God had been looking at beforehand. All of these people that were living their lives without the knowledge of God, really, without even recognizing God in the midst of the day, eating their manna, not thinking about God, which we later realize that's a prophecy of Jesus, eating that heavenly food. What was that food? I'm sure it's never been on earth since. It was a heavenly food from heaven. It wasn't of the earth. The pillar of cloud. I've learned, I've been in places in Austria and in Italy and stuff, and they're looking at these amazing mountains that we have pictures of on our computer screens, and you're just sort of in awe every day. It takes your breath away. And you ask them about it who lived there their whole life, they're going, oh yeah, there's a mountain up there, okay. Same way with people who have lived on the beach, on the ocean. It's like, oh, you get up on vacation, if you get a hotel by the ocean, you're like, oh, this is amazing, especially if you're from Oklahoma or something. But yet the people that live by the ocean, no big deal, Our earth is amazing. It's like that. Every once in a while, I'll get here when they just cut the grass, the big park here, and you just get that big whiff of fresh cut grass. It's amazing to me. It's like a waterfall or a sunset. Or I was walking out behind the building this last Sunday, and there was this amazing, beautiful smell. And I don't know if it was from the jasmine or what, but I don't know. I'm just stopped with the beauty and the amazement of God. But these people did not have the knowledge of God. But now God looks at the millions of people, the hundreds of thousands of tents, and he sees dad at the front, and then mom there. The kids observe mom and dad at the front of the tent. Maybe the kids that are older are there. They're beginning to be stirred in that holy hush of God's that the little toddlers play. What a beautiful sight that must have been to God. All the people rose and worshiped. Each man stood at his tent door. And as Moses talked to God, they talked to God. I don't know what they said, or maybe they didn't have enough knowledge of God to say anything other than to just sense the overflow of the Shekinah on Moses was just sort of a wave that would crash on them as they stood at the door. I know in the Jesus movement, the closer you got to the front of the building, the greater the power of the Spirit. And so people would get there an hour, 2 hours early to get as close as they could. And often they would sit on the floor or sit on the steps. It would be, just feet away from whoever is speaking. Just wanted to get pressing in. And boy, if you were on the back, you sort of mourned because you knew that you're getting a splash of the Spirit, but not the douse of like they were on that front row. Worship was sweeter. Prayer was sweeter. Hearing the word was clearer. It was an amazing thing. So I really think that God met them in their faith at that front door of their house. And I think they sensed the Spirit of God. What did Moses talk about for 40 days and 40 nights? What's Moses talking about all those hours every single day? I don't know. That'd be really cool to have had a recorder in there, huh? And maybe when we get to see the heavenly videotapes, we can go in there and just sit for, 100,000 years and listen to Moses' conversation with God, What do you think they were talking about, Was Moses going, I got a stain there on my robe, What do you think about that, God? I don't know. I think it was very casual, shooting the breeze at times. I don't think it was intense all the time. I think it was just hanging out and thinking and praying and experiencing that presence of God. And it was beautiful, I do believe, to the Lord. Well, verse 11. So the Lord spoke to Moses face to face, as a man speaks to his friend. And he would return to the camp, but his servant Joshua, the son of Nun, the young man, did not depart from the tabernacle. So this phrase, the Lord spoke to Moses face to face as one man speaks to his friends. Now this Hebrew word is panim, P-A-N-I-M. And it is a word that can mean face, but it can also mean the presence of God. Not necessarily a part of your anatomy, okay? There is another word we're going to see in a minute that is the word for anatomy of your face, and it's just the word pay. But this word is almost like a metaphor for the face. It's like you're close to them in presence. And a matter of fact, in verse 14, we're going to get there, but it says, and he, God, he says, my presence, that's the same word as face. My face will go with you, and I will give you rest. Now, we know that he couldn't be seeing God face to face as one man talks to another man. It just says as one friend talks to another friend. But remember in 1 John 4:12, no man has seen God at any time. If we love one another, God abides in us, and his love has been perfected in us. So no one's seen God at any time, and the closest we're going to get to seeing God is as we love one another. That's as perfect as we'll ever get on this earth to being face to face with God, is living in his love and treating one another in that love. Now, God later on brings up this story in Numbers chapter 12, verse 8. And the reason it's very interesting because God uses a different word. In Numbers chapter 12, verse 8, and he says, I speak to him face to face. Now, if you have a New King James Version, it says face to face. If you have almost any other version, it actually says mouth to mouth. That's literally, more specifically, what it is saying is mouth to mouth. Even plainly and not in dark sayings. And he sees a form of the Lord. Why then were you not afraid to speak against my servant Moses? So God says, Moses is the guy that I talked mouth to mouth. Much more closely and intimate. He said, I talked plainly, not in dark sayings. And when you really think about it, it's like, yeah, everybody else really did have sort of an indirect hearing from God. You know, I think of Abraham in Genesis 15. He goes into this deep sleep, and in this deep sleep, he has this vision, and he realizes his children will be enslaved for 4 generations. And then you have like Jacob, you know, he sees the ladder and the angels going up and down on the ladder. And he's like, well, the presence of God was here. It's like, what does that mean? I don't know. And this is what we see. Joseph, he had dreams, and there was the hay and the stars and the moon and everything bowed down. It was, and God is saying, I didn't have those kind of conversations. So the one thing when God talked to Moses, what it's saying is it wasn't in riddles. It wasn't in metaphors. It wasn't in symbolic language like we see in the book of Revelation. It was as clear as one human being speaking to another human being directly. And then, in that word again, mouth is pay, mouth to mouth. I think I said it wrong a minute ago. But face to face, presence of God to the presence of God, or mouth to mouth. It was directly as a man can talk to God at this point in time. And then he gives a note that Joshua, the son of Nun, this young man, couldn't get enough. That when Moses left and the people that were out there left and everybody left the tent doors of their tents, that Joshua was off the clock. He wasn't Moses' assistant after that time. He clocked out. But he was hungry for more. He was thirsty for more. Whatever he was experiencing, Moses wanted more, but Joshua wanted more. He reminds me sort of the New Testament Timothy that Paul had. I have no one like-minded. And then he says, for he has a son and has served with his father, so he served with me. Joshua was that spiritual son of Moses. And how did he look like that son? He had a hunger. He was there on the mount with Moses. Remember that? At a distance. When it came, he wasn't down there in the valley with the people. And he was always wanting more, even more than Moses wanted God. This quiet guy, Joshua, his claim to fame now is that he was the guy who lingered longer at the tent than anybody. Now let's stop here and just talk about this important note. This kind of worship, praying, seeking God, intimate prayer time, seems very personal between one person and God alone. This is the point God is making. Our conversations were very personal. It was between us. Some of it was for the people, and you got to know that. But Moses was a man wanting to know God more and more intimately, a very personal and private way. As we study through the Bible, it's repeatedly clear that God wants us. He desperately desires us individually, personally, like a father to a son, or a shepherd to the sheep, or a friend to a friend, or as an engaged couple passionately desiring each other, or a honeymoon couple passionately wanting each other on their honeymoon, or a husband and a wife. I think we really get some of this when we read the Song of Solomon. In chapter 2, verse 10, it says, my beloved spoke, and he said to me, rise up, my love, my fair one, and come away. So Solomon's coming to grab his wife, his newlywed wife, and they're almost like on a honeymoon, and he raises up to get her. And in chapter 2, verse 4, he brought me to the banqueting house, and his banner over me was love. In chapter 3, verse 4, scarcely had I passed by them when I found the one I love. I held him. I would not let him go until I had brought him to the house of my mother and to the chamber of her who conceived me. And then in chapter 4, verse 9 and 10 of Song of Solomon, you have ravished me, my heart. You have ravished my heart, my sister, my spouse. You have ravished my heart with one look of your eyes, with one link of your necklace. How fair is your love, my sister, my spouse. How much better than wine is your love, and the scent of her perfumes than all spices. Isaiah 40 paints a very intimate picture of God as our shepherd. In verse 11, Isaiah 40:11, he will feed his flock like a shepherd. He will gather his lambs with his arm and carry them in his bosom, gently lead those who are with young. How the Lord wants to just scoop us up. I'm that way around little lambs or little puppies or little kittens or don't you just want to just pick them up and just, you can't squeeze them, and you're rubbing your nose with their nose, and they start licking you, and you just start, burying your head in the side, kissing them. God made things like that. It just blows my mind sometimes when I see that. I'm just like, God, you're cute. You've got this cutesy thing about you. It's in his nature. He's created it. This is what we see here with his little baby sheep. We are that baby sheep. And then in Ephesians 5, a passage we're very familiar with, in verse 25 to 28, God as the husband to the church. Husband, love your wives just as Christ loved the church and gave himself for her, that he might sanctify and cleanse her with the washing of the water by the word. He might present her to himself a glorious church, not having spot or wrinkle or any such thing, but that she should be holy and without blemish. So husbands are to love your own wives as their own bodies. He who loves his wife loves himself. So Christ loves us so much. He can't wait to present us in heaven, past the pearly gates, to the Father himself. And then, of course, in Revelation, Jesus spoke in chapter 2, verse 17. He said, "And I will give him a white stone, and on the stone a new name written, which no one knows except him who receives it." I mean, how precious. God said everybody individually is going to have a pet name that I'll whisper in their ear for all of eternity. Nobody's going to know that pet name. It's just between me and you. We get this incredibly great desire for wanting more, desiring deeper, hungering more, thirsting more. Blessed are those who hunger and thirst. Now, typically, if you hunger and you eat and you're not filled, that's a bad thing. You drink and you're not filled, that's sort of a scary thing. But not spiritually. Each time we seek God, we should hunger for more. Each time we drink of the Spirit, we should long for more. But this is for spiritually minded people. Paul bemoans the fact that these casual, carnal Christians in Corinth were not experiencing it. In 1 Corinthians 3, in verse 1 through 3, he says, "I, brethren, could not speak to you as spiritual people, but as carnal, as to babes in Christ." Now, they're Christians, they're believers. He calls them believers. He tells them they're, in the beginning of chapter 1, some beautiful things about them. "But I fed you with milk and not with solid food." Oh, I'm Apollos. These guys are great, deep teachers. And Paul is saying, when I was there, I couldn't really pull out my deep stuff. Maybe Apollos and Peter and stuff taught you some deep stuff, but I found personally that I wasn't able to do that with you. "For until now, you're not able to receive it. Even now, you're still not able, for you are still carnal." And then he goes on in chapter 2 to say, "However, we do speak wisdom among those who are mature, yet not the wisdom of this age." And then down in verse 9 of 1 Corinthians 2, he says, "But it's written, eye has not seen, ear has not heard, nor has entered into the heart of man the things which God's prepared for those who love him." Do we realize this? There is knowledge, there is insight, there is revelation that God wants to give you. And I honestly think it's so much revelation that we can't really explain it to anybody. He's touched our heart. He's changed us. He's notched another level of maturity in us. And I cannot explain this new love he put into me, or this new passion he's put into me, or this desire for holiness that I have. I can't really teach it or explain it. It's just something that God has done in my heart. And then he goes on to say, "But God has revealed them to us through his Spirit. For the Spirit searches all things, just the deep things of God." Verse 11, "For what man knows the things of a man except the spirit of the man which is in him? Even so no one knows the things of God except the Spirit of God. Now we have received not the spirit of the world, but the Spirit who is from God, that we might know the things which are freely given to us by God. These things also speak, not in words which man's wisdom teaches, but in which the Holy Spirit teaches, comparing spiritual things with spiritual words." Or literally, that in the Greek, it's comparing spiritual to spiritual. Spiritual words, spiritual things, spiritual revelation to spiritual insight, whatever it is, spiritual to spirit. It's just something God works in the Spirit, spirit to spirit. As you fellowship deeply with the Lord, his Spirit speaks to your spirit. But in verse 14, the natural man does not receive the things of the Spirit of God, for they are foolishness to him, nor can he know them because they are spiritually discerned. Verse 15, but he who is spiritual judges all things, yet he himself is judged by no one. For who has known the mind of the Lord, that we may instruct him? But we do have the mind of Christ. Wow. So it's something that the carnal, natural man, the natural man not born again, or the carnal Christian who can't seem to have that fellowship from spirit to spirit with God because of that carnalness. But yet God still has them when we're ready to get there. And moving back on over to Exodus chapter 33 through 12 to 13. Then Moses said to the Lord, see, you say to me, bring up this people, but you have not let me know whom you will send with me. Yet you have said, I know your name, and you have also found grace in my sight. Now therefore I pray, if I have found grace in your sight, show me now your way that I may know you, that I may find grace in your sight, and consider that this nation is your people. So Moses comes back and says, God, we've got some unfinished business here. And if you'll note, he's being sort of rude. He's being sort of, a little bit nippity with God. Now the last thing you said was, let me kill all those people off. And we haven't really had a conversation since you wanted to kill everybody. And then you said, okay, best case scenario, an angel or something will go with you, but I'm not going to personally go with you. And I've got to get this clear, because having your blessings is not enough. And we haven't had a conversation where you have clearly retracted that and said, I myself will be going with you as well. You haven't said that. So Moses is pushing in. He is pressing God. And this is, again, a part of revival. You'll find that people cannot live with the way things are, whether it's in their own life or in their own household or in their own city or in their own nation or in the world. It's out of the revival in England. They stopped slavery 100 years before America did. Out of a revival, they just couldn't stand the fact that people were being sold as slaves. And you can go on and see that God the people begin to get dissatisfied with where they have been with God. And it almost angers them that they haven't been where they need to be. And now they're saying, I think there's more. I think what I have experienced of you is not the ceiling. And I think there's more. And one thing I've seen with you, God, is our relationship is based out of grace. I have found grace in your sight. And because I found grace in your sight, I am bold. I'm almost rude. I'm pressing in and almost overstepping the bounds of polite society here, because my relationship is based on grace with you. I love that. That wrestling. It's like Jacob wrestling with God. Moses isn't praying here. He's this revival, this awakening, this sword moment. God whips out his sword. I'm going to cut them all off and start somebody new from you. Go tell them I'm going to plague them all. I blot them out of that book if I want to, and he sent a plague on them. It's almost like God whipping out his sword, but Moses whipping out his sword now. And it's like saying, hey, I'm not messing around here, God. I mean it. I have to have your full presence, or I'm not going myself. I love verse 13. Notice it says your 3 times, but there's another time implied. He says, your way, that I may know you, in your sight, with your people. This is something you started. I know often I have to remind Satan of that. Bryan, you're such a sinner. Bryan, you're such a carnal person. Bryan, I don't know if God really called you as a Christian. And I quickly, used to scare me when Satan would say stuff like that to my brain. But then I just now go, hey, I may be a big loser, but God picked me. I may be a big lemon, but he picked me. I'm his child. It's too late. I've been grafted in. Too late. I'm a branch. I'm here. His Spirit lives in me. Too late. You're never going to leave me, forsake me. And in essence, Moses is saying this to God. This is your way. It's your side. It's your people. Moses was hungry to understand God and his ways, his thoughts, his will. He just wanted him, period. And the thought of taking one more step without this wonderful presence of God, and then to get down to the Jordan. We're going to cross over. We're going to have the wars and the blessings and obtain the land, but God's presence is on the other side of the Jordan. Moses was just distraught by that thought, angered at that thought. And then he just spills it out in verse 13. He just says, that I may know you. And then we come to verse 14, to verse 17. And he said, my presence will go with you, and I will give you rest. And then he said to him, if your presence does not go with us, then do not bring us up from here. Whoa! Moses, you better get up on a different side of the bed tomorrow. My goodness, God just said, okay, my presence will go with you, and I'll give you rest. You better go with me. If you don't, we're going to have some problems. In verse 16, for how then will it be known that your people and I have found grace in your sight, except you go with us? So we will be separate, your people and I, from all the people upon the face of the earth. And the Lord said to Moses, I will also do this thing that you have spoken, for you have found grace in my sight, and I know you by name. So Moses said, okay, I receive that word. I receive the grace. And I receive this new knowledge of you. I get it. And God is saying, you got it. That's what you wanted, Moses? I'm going to do exceedingly abundantly above all you ask or think. And so Moses makes it absolutely clear here that it's really not the tabernacle or the priesthood or the land. What's the world is going to see that's going to separate them from all the peoples in the world is God's actual presence, and nothing less than that. He says, literally, my presence will go with you. Again, that's the word face. My face will be there with you. Isaiah mentions this in Isaiah 63, verse 9. He says, in all their afflictions, he was afflicted. Isn't that great? God was in all their afflictions with them. And the angel, referring to Jesus this time, the angel of his presence saved them. In his love and in his pity, he redeemed them, and he bore them and carried them all the days of old. In Exodus 23:20, remember he had said earlier that I love that title, angel of his presence. Jesus is also the messenger of his presence, the ambassador of his presence, the word of his presence. In the beginning was the Word. The Word was with God, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. The Word, the messenger, the ambassador. And this is what he had said earlier in Exodus 23:20. Behold, I send an angel, Jesus, before you to keep you in the way and to bring you into the place which I have prepared. We have gotten back. Relationship is restored to get back to where we want to be. And then he says, you'll know my name. And he also said, I will give you rest. The word name is nature, character. He literally is telling him, you are going to learn the nature of God. That's really what we're doing when we study the Bible. When we read Genesis chapter 1, we're really learning about the nature of God. When we're looking at the last book of Revelation, we're learning the nature of God. That's who he is his nature, his character, his characteristics. What he loves and what he hates. What he likes, what he dislikes. What makes him happy, what makes him sad. We learn the limits of his presence, of his knowledge, of his power, which is infinite. All of these things we learn. I think of Paul there at Mars Hill in Acts 17, where he's like, hey, I've noticed you guys have an idol to every god. You even had one, in case you forgot one, saying to the unknown God, this is the God I want to talk to you about. Well, he's been known from the beginning. To know that unknown God, we can know him. We're not going to get to heaven and walk to the pearly gates, and Peter's going to go, well, here's Jesus. We're going to go, nice to meet you. I'm so glad. I've heard so much. I've read out so much about you. Can I see your hand? You got a real scar? You get there? Wow. Man, I'm so glad I'm in heaven. I get to know you now, Jesus, and I hope we get to know each other better. Are we going to live next door to each other? Is that the way it's going to be? I'll just tell you right now, that saying that says, if you know God, then you're known by God. If you don't know God, then in eternity you won't know God. If you know God now, you'll know him forever. If you don't know God now, you will not know him ever. And the fact is, we're going to see Jesus. I had a dream one time, and I walked into this room. I love wood, and this room was just wood everywhere. On the floors, on the sides, beautiful wood, and the desk. The desk was fully wood and had such a beautiful smell of wood in it, fresh wood. And I walk in and I'm looking and I'm like, you look familiar. And the guy from behind the desk gets up and starts to walk around the desk, and I'm like, I hate this, but I know you. And then he walked up right next to me, and I looked up, and it was Jesus. And I hugged him, and he hugged me. And you know that kind of hug where you just don't let go? And he didn't let me go, and I didn't let him go. And I can't explain it. But I woke up from that just going, oh, man. It makes it hard to live on earth when you have a dream like that. But this is it. You'll know me, and you will find rest. Now, we know what that's talking about, don't we? Because there's 2 chapters in the Bible on that phrase. I wish we had time to go into it tonight. We don't. But Hebrews chapter 3 and Hebrews chapter 4 is on that subject. I will give you rest. And he says, the children of Israel never got that one. Moses, Joshua, they got that one. They got rest. But Moses couldn't give them rest. And he says specifically in Hebrews 4, Joshua never gave them rest. Because this verse is really speaking about a rest that only the Messiah could give. And now he is saying to these Jews, the whole book of Hebrews is written to Jews who are thinking about going back to Judaism and leaving Christ. And he says, you guys are doing exactly what your forefathers did in the Old Testament. And that is, they never entered into the rest of God because of their unbelief. And now you're making the same foolish decision here. But he's going to bring us there, and we're going to know his name, his character, his nature. Verse 18, and he said, please show me your glory. Oh, Moses won, didn't he? He's got God. God's like, he's like putting pressure on God. You're going to go with us. You don't go with us, don't go. Okay, I'll go with you. You better really go with us. If you don't leave me up from here. I'm going to go with you. I'm going to give you rest. You'll know me. You'll know my name. And Moses is like, boy, I got God on the run. I'm winning the argument. And show me your glory. Wow. He's not stopping, is he? He's pressing in for more. Now, when we look in Exodus 16, everybody saw the glory of the Lord in the cloud. In Exodus 24, when Moses went up on the mount, they saw the glory of God consuming the mountain there with their own eyes. But Moses is saying, we've seen your glory, we've experienced your glory, but there's a lot more. The word glory in the Hebrew is the word kabod. It's literally the word for weight. So maybe you remember in your physics, my teacher had a big iron bearing. And then he had a ball of cotton. And he said, which one has the greater weight? The same size, but one has density to it, doesn't it? Kabod. And Moses is saying, I've got some of your weight, but it's like a cotton ball. I want the weighty stuff. I want the kabod. I want the glory. And in verse 19 and 20, he said, I will make all my goodness pass before you, and I will proclaim the name of the Lord before you, and I will be gracious to whom I'll be gracious, and I'll have compassion on whom I'll have compassion. And he said, you cannot see my face, for no one can see my face and live. So Moses, I want to see your glory. And God says, I know what you want. You can't get it. It's humanly impossible. If you did see the infinite God in your finite, sinful body, you would vaporize. It would just, you'd go to ash. But I can take you deeper. And the next step in deepness of God is to know God's goodness. I don't think Moses was expecting that. I don't think Moses was going, okay, you'll see my goodness. And not really all my goodness, just the trailing end of my goodness he's going to find out. So it wasn't God's going to show him into heaven. God was going to show him the cherubim and the seraphims flying around the throne. He wasn't going to show them justice, or he wasn't going to show them holiness or power or the wrath against sin. He just says it's in one word. When you see my presence in a deeper way, it's going to leave you with a sense of knowing that God is good. I love that. David Guzik writes this: sometimes people think they must balance God, supposing there is something like a yin and a yang to the universe, a sense of light and dark, good and evil, law and grace. But God himself is unbalanced in this sense. He is entirely good. Even in his justice, in his power, in his wrath, it still must be understood that all of these things are in the aspect of his goodness, right? And then he says again here, I will proclaim the name of the Lord before you. I'm going to let you see my goodness, and then you'll hear of the goodness of God audibly. You can't see it, but I didn't say you couldn't hear it. So you're not going to get enough to really satisfy. It's going to go by quickly. It's going to be just the trailing end of the glory. You're going to get a look at it going, oh, I didn't get a replay. Hit reverse. I'm going to replay that. And you're going to be walking away going, oh, man, it wasn't long enough. I didn't get to see it clear enough. But the word you hear will satisfy. And what is that word? Chapter 34 next week. Sorry about that. You got to come next week to hear about it. But anyway, let's finish up here in verse 21 to 23. And the Lord said, here is a place by me. You shall stand on the rock. so it shall be while my glory passes by, that I will put you in the cleft of the rock, and I will cover you with my hand while I pass by. And I will take away my hand, and you'll see my back, but my face shall not be seen. I think this could be the same place that Elijah saw the nature of God. Remember Elijah? He was so mad at God. He battled the Baal worshipers and called fire to heaven, and they were all killed. And then he just runs and he's exhausted. Jezebel and Ahab said they're going to kill him, and he's just distraught. He gives up. He's lying down to die, and God feeds him and gives him to drink. He falls back to sleep. God gives him to eat and drink, and he gets up and he runs to the mountain of God in Sinai. And this is where I think he went. And he's in this cave, sort of pouting. And all of a sudden, remember what happened? Mighty rushing wind, and boulders are flying, and Elijah goes, oh, God's presence wasn't in that magnificent blowing of the wind. And then what was there? Remember? An earthquake. And then there was a fire. And in each of these things, God's presence wasn't manifest. But then there was a little tiny breeze. Can also be a still small voice. And what did Elijah do? He fell to the ground and wrapped and covered his face because the presence of God was there. See, that's who God was. That gentle voice. And if you saw it in a glimpse, you would see how good God is. And we're going to get the definition and detail of that next week. Well, quickly here, Isaiah chapters, he saw God and he was undone. He's like, I'm dead. Holy, righteous man, Isaiah was, but he said, I can't live anymore now that I've seen God. And God had to have an angel touch his lips and purify him. John, the great apostle, he fell down as a dead man in Revelation 1:17 when he saw Jesus. And then Paul in 2 Corinthians 12, when he saw the Lord in heaven, he said, I cannot tell you what I saw. It would be sinful to try to put into human words what I experienced. But I love what Paul says, I think, talking about this very passage in 1 Corinthians 13:12. For now we see in a mirror, sorry, I don't think I have that verse there for you, but in 1 Corinthians 13:12, but now we see in a mirror dimly, but then what? Face to face. Now I know in part, but then I shall know just as I have known. And he says here, you're just going to see the back of me. You can't see my face. But then what happens in the New Testament? In John 1:14, the Word became flesh and dwelt among us. And what did we behold? His glory. As of the glory as the only begotten of the Father, full of grace and truth. And of the fullness I have also received. What? Grace upon grace. Of his fullness we've received. We saw his glory, that thing that Moses desired to look into. Jesus, God with us, came as a babe in Bethlehem. And then in his adult life, as he begins his ministry, it's unveiled to everyone. And what happens in born-again believers now? In 2 Corinthians 3:18, but we all with unveiled face, beholding in the mirror, what? The glory of the Lord. Still beholding in a mirror, though. Are being transformed into the same image, glory to glory, just as by the Spirit of the Lord. As long as we're in this earth, we're going to be looking into that polished brass, right? That was their mirror in those days. You're not going to see very clearly. But nevertheless, it doesn't mean that God can't get us there spirit to spirit, that God can't bring us closer to himself to see him in his glory. I love reading books about the men of God of history since the Bible. Great autobiography, or biography, I should say. Jonathan Edward writes it, and he takes the journal of a guy named David Bernard. It'll change your life. The first part of the book is the actual autobiography of of Jonathan Edwards himself, and then the second half of the book is the journal of David Brainerd. But he was the first guy to go preach to the American Indians. Young guy, died at 26, but he led thousands of Indians to the Lord. But it was amazing what they saw and what he experienced when he got in the woods out there by himself. Easily could get killed. And he just starts praying and what God does and the glory of God that Indians saw as he prayed. So I still know that if we're willing to have that heart of Moses, then we can also experience that.